33:1, and he's talking about the spoiler. Woe to thee, 33:1, that spoilest. And he's talking about Assyria. He has called Babylon before. He's called Babylon the spoiler. But in this context, he's talking about Assyria. This does something interesting. We have been situated for the first part of this study in Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. Those texts deal largely, though there are some complexities along the way. This time frame deals with the Assyrian crisis to a large degree. And so when we think about this, we ought to think basically the year 701. We're going to see a text in chapters 36 through 39 where it's actually not Assyria anymore, but the crisis is Babylonian. And we're going to be dealing with the Babylonian people and deliverance from them. And the years we have to think of in that regard are 586. It's not a coincidence that largely then is 40 through 66 is who he's talking about, chapters 40 through 66. It's not a coincidence that in this context, in 33:1, he calls Assyria the spoiler. But back in 21 verse 2, he has called Babylon the spoiler. He's making a link between the two. And so even though they're different faces, different people, different names, he's getting at the same idea. Here's somebody who has oppressed the people of God. Oh, it may be Tiglath-Pileser or Sargon or Sennacherib, some of those Assyrian kings. But don't be shocked if he gives them another name and he's talking about the Babylonian people. It's the same kind of person. Not the same person, the same kind of person. Somebody who has oppressed God's people. So here he delivers another woe or another oracle against the wicked oppressor. And he says, woe to the spoiler, and thou wast not spoiled. You, Israel, you were not spoiled. And dealest treacherously, and they dealt not treacherously with thee. When thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. And when thou shalt make an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. In common terms, he's simply saying judgment's moving in upon the person who has been doing the judgment. Namely, Assyria. Assyria has been attacking God's people. God's going to see to it that they get there. So he says in 33:2, O Lord, be gracious unto us. We have waited for thee. And we've talked about that to some degree. They need to put their trust in God. Be thou their arm every morning, our salvation also in the time of trouble. At the noise of the tumult the people fled. At the lifting up of thyself the nations were scattered. And your spoil shall be gathered like the gathering of the caterpillar. As the running to and fro of locusts shall he run upon them. And then here's what he's getting at. Here's the big theological point in verse 5. The Lord is exalted. He dwells on high. He has filled Zion with judgment and righteousness. See, they've been putting their trust in whom? Who were some of those nations when Assyria was moving in? Egypt. There's the big one. They thought, well, if we're not going to be able to link up with Assyria, we need to look for help somewhere else. And they thought, oh, maybe Egypt will help us. Good, Dusty. And God said, you should have been trusting in me the whole time. So the Lord's going to be exalted in the thing. And it says in verse 6, wisdom, knowledge, those two things will be the stability of thy times, and strength of salvation. The fear of the Lord is his treasure. Anybody familiar with the verse in Proverbs 1:7? Where it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, beginning of wisdom. See, the people had misunderstood that kind of thing. They had been thinking, well, we'll trust Egypt, we'll trust Babylon, we'll trust Assyria. No, they should have been trusting God. Okay, so in chapter 33, verses 1 through 6, you have a time here that's discussed about. It's a time of retribution, a time of assurance. God is telling the people of Israel, better times are coming. And then he says in verse 7, he starts this next section through verse 16. And this is a time of shock, or a time of bewilderment. And he says in verse 7, their valiant ones shall cry without. The ambassadors of peace shall weep bitterly. Who were these ambassadors of peace? Somebody get 2 Kings for us. Somebody turn over to 2 Kings and get chapter 18, where you've got this passage that runs hand in hand with Isaiah's text. 2 Kings 18, verses 13 through 16. Whoever's got it, go ahead.
Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah had Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, I have offended. Return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, and in the treasures of the king's house. At that time did Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord, and from the pillars which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria.
Look at this. Hezekiah takes the money, takes the gold, takes a tribute, takes a payment, and he sends it by hands of ambassadors up to Assyria. And he says, oh, we'll make a league with you. We'll pay you off. This way you won't attack us. You think that works? No. Assyria, they take the money and still perform the siege. So they send these ambassadors of peace, and it goes on to say in verse 17, look at that if you're still in 2 Kings 18. And the king of Assyria then sends Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh. And if you read the rest of the narrative, as we're about to do in Isaiah's text, it's the same kind of passage. Do not go ahead and read 2 Kings 18. We'll get there in Isaiah's text. But he goes ahead and tells us, oh, by the way, even though they send the money, the invasion still happens. Take a look then at Isaiah 33 again. In Isaiah 33, King Hezekiah sends people to link up with Assyria, and it still fails. Sometimes we get these schemes in our minds where we say, maybe if we link up with the denominations, we'll really do the church some good. No, it's not going to pan out. What you end up doing is you end up corrupting the good people. You end up corrupting truth. It's not going to do anything for us. And so we've got to go ahead and take that hard and fast stand and say this is what the truth is. Whether people like it or not, we let the chips fall where they may. And that's what Hezekiah should have done. He should have just told the people, this is how it is. But instead he tried to be a compromiser. And he says in verse 8, the highways lie waste. This is 33:8 of Isaiah. The highways lie waste. The wayfaring man ceases. He, probably speaking of Assyria, who had even made that covenant, that league with Hezekiah, well, he broke the covenant. He despised the cities of Israel and Judah. He regards no man. Well, he will regard God. And it says in verse 9, the earth mourns. We've talked about that. When the land is suffering, it demonstrates the people in exile. When the land is rejoicing, it's a figure of speech for the people out of captivity. And it says in verse 9, the earth mourns and languisheth. Lebanon is ashamed and hewn down. Sharon is like a wilderness. Bashan and Carmel shake off their fruits. All of these places, by the way, are situated right around here in the Judean place, in the Palestinian area. And it says in 33:10, now will I rise, saith the Lord. Now will I be exalted. Now will I lift up myself. God is going to be the one who's recognized in this. Not the people. God will be. He's the Redeemer. And it says in verse 11, you will conceive chaff, which is like the dust or the leftover, the remnant of a field. You know, after the harvest has already been executed, it's everything that's still laying on the ground. You'll be like chaff. You'll bring forth stubble. Your breath as fire shall devour you. And it's picturing judgment ultimately. Verse 12, and the people shall be as the burnings of lime, as thorns cut up shall they be burned in the fire. Once again, a motif for judgment. And it says in 33:13, hear ye that are far off what I have done, and ye that are near acknowledge my might. Pay attention to me, God is saying. And he says in 14, the sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness hath surprised the hypocrites. And then here's this question that's asked. And we ask the same kind of thing today. Who among us will dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? The question they're asking is, when judgment moves in, who's going to still be standing after the world burns? And if God's the one bringing the fire, the idea is the righteous. Who's going to be able to stand when judgment moves in? The people who have sided with the one doing the judging. Those who are on God's side. And so Isaiah pictures a remnant in Zion. See, the hypocrites, it said in 13 and 14, it's the hypocrites, the sinners that are going to be purged. But the righteous are going to appreciate the thing. The righteous are going to say, thanks be to God for bringing in a judgment upon the people who have been oppressing the others. Remember, we've talked about those who are fudging the certificates. We've talked about the people who are stealing from the poor. They're robbing their lands. They're taking their money. They're oppressing the fatherless and the widows. Those are the kinds of people that the judgment's moving in on. If you're a righteous person trying to uphold justice and truth and peace, you're thankful to God for that kind of thing. He's vindicating His cause. And so it says in verse 15, he that walks righteously and speaks uprightly, he that despiseth the gain of his oppressions, that shaketh his hands from holding of bribes, that stops his ears from hearing of blood, and shuts his eyes from seeing evil. He, verse 16, will be the one that dwells on high. See, 15 and 16 is that answer to the question asked in 14. Who's going to be able to stand when the judgment comes in? Verses 15 and 16 says, the righteous. Isaiah is thinking when God judges Assyria, who's going to appreciate it? The righteous. And in verse 16 it says, his place of defense shall be the munitions of rocks. Bread shall be given him. His water shall be sure. Some of this sounds a lot like the Psalms, doesn't it? Think about that. Does it sound like anything we've really heard when it says his water shall be sure? Psalm 23 sounds strikingly similar. Oh, his tree will be planted by the rivers of water. It'll bring forth fruit in its season. Bountiful. The place is going to be bountiful. The righteous are going to be bountiful once again. In verse 17, watch what they're going to do. Thine eyes shall see the king in his beauty. They shall behold the land that is very far off. This raises a question. Who is the king? Most of the scholars tell us that it's probably Hezekiah. And the scholars say, well, Hezekiah was the king at this time. He had taken the throne as the sole ruler in 715 and would ultimately die in the year 686. And they say, so what's going to happen is that Syria is going to invade in 701. Hezekiah is going to be on the throne and the people are going to appreciate that. But somebody read verse 22 for us. Whoever's got verse 22, go ahead.
For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is the lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He shall save us.
Yeah, that's fitting. See, it's not Hezekiah who delivered the people. Hezekiah wasn't really all that great. In fact, his eulogy in 2 Kings 18, 4 through 6 says this. Oh, Hezekiah was a good man, but he didn't remove the idols out of the land. Wouldn't it be good if on our tombstones it said something like, he was a good man, and it didn't say that thing about removing the idols out of the land, failing to do so? Wouldn't it just be good if it said he was a righteous man? That'd be good. See, in 2 Kings 18, we learn something about Hezekiah. He wasn't all that great. Oh, he tried sometimes, but he still had his weaknesses. The person that's redeeming Israel, the people that redeemed you and the person that redeemed me, that's God. That's our Redeemer. If Hezekiah happens to play a part in it, then so be it. But the Lord is the king. The Lord is the one they're going to witness. Look at 17 again. 33:17. Thine eyes, when Assyria is judged, you'll see the real king in his beauty. Isaiah had already seen the king in his beauty. When did he see it? When Uzziah the king had died. Then he said, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. Sometimes we have to see the crisis in order to see really who reigns above us all. And so in 33:18, your heart will meditate terror. Where's the scribe? Where's the receiver? Where is he that counted the towers? The idea they're getting at is you had people counting the numbers, counting the towers, making sure the walls were set for an invasion, and none of that mattered. They should have been focusing on God. And he says this in 19, you'll not see a fierce people, a people of a deeper speech than thou canst perceive, speaking of Assyria, of a stammering tongue that you cannot understand. Look upon Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eyes shall see Jerusalem, a quiet habitation, a tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed, neither shall any of the cords thereof be broken. Does that sound like anything? If somebody speaks to you about stakes and cords, what do you think of? There you go. Joe, did you say that? A tent. Imagine if they had nailed the pegs down into the ground And these were cords that they were using that could never be broken. God pictures His city after He has brought a refining judgment as an immovable or unshakable tent, an eternal tent. What does that make the Jews think of? Did they have a tent in their past?
Tabernacle.
There you go. They had the tabernacle. Imagine preaching to the Jews about an unstoppable tabernacle. That's the idea. That's what he's getting at in verse 20. He says, you're going to have another tabernacle, another tent. It'll never be removed. And he's picturing Jerusalem in the best of its days. They don't know what that means exactly. It comes to its ultimate fulfillment in Acts chapter 2. Now, you're familiar with that. Okay, 33 verse 21. But there the glorious Lord will be unto us a place of broad rivers and streams, living water. It's going to flow again. Blessings are coming. Wherein shall go no galley with oars, neither shall gallant ship pass thereby. And then we see verse 22, the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, He's our Redeemer, He'll save us. Not Hezekiah, not somebody else, not Egypt, Jehovah God. And he says in 23 and 24, the tacklings are loose, they could not well strengthen their mast, they could not spread the sail, then is the prey of a great spoil divided, the lame take the prey. Here's where the little guy, the lame man, the blind, the deaf, the people that have the infirmities, the people that have been wronged, they're back on top. They've sided with righteousness. And so he says in 24, and the inhabitant shall not say, I am sick. The people that dwell therein shall be forgiven their iniquity. God pictures in a very poetic way Jerusalem being purged of sin and righteousness dwells there again. Any questions, any comments on 33? Yes.
Looking back at verses 5 and 6 about wisdom and knowledge being the stability and salvation, the fear of the Lord, we could link that to Hebrews 11, where knowledge of what has happened before.
Yeah.
Faith is knowledge, faith is evidence.
Yes. They had a lot of examples in their past. Yeah. Anything else? Good point. Okay. 34 is admittedly tricky, but bear with me. Go ahead and look at 34, 5, and 6, so we go ahead and have the idea of what the prophet is suggesting. In 34, 5, he explicitly tells us, my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea, Edom. If you were looking at a map, it's going to be about right here. Edom or Idumea is just another spelling of it. And then he gives us one of their capital cities, the city Bozrah, in verse 6. And he's talking about Edom, verse 5, and then he says in verse 6, he says, the sword of the Lord is filled with blood, it is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams, for the Lord hath a sacrifice in, this is one of those important capital cities of Edom, in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. What we are about to see then, the prophet tells us, whatever he's picturing in 34, is the judgment of Edom. That shouldn't be debated. That's what he tells us. Now look at this. Somebody get Malachi 1, verses 1 through 3 for us.
What chapters here are together?
34 and 35 are
Okay.
coupled.
So is there like a separation or a division between 33 going into 34 and 35?
Yeah. A lot of these, so like he says in 33:1, woe to the spoiler. Well, 33 is almost its own separate little oracle. See, Isaiah doesn't put all of this, he doesn't start in 1:1 and write until 66:24. What he does is he presents, and it's possible even that somebody else writes it down for him. Paul had that happen, so says Romans 16:23. The man's name was Tertius for Paul. Isaiah explicitly says in Isaiah 8:17 and 18 that he had disciples that would write for him. Isaiah 8:17 and 18, Isaiah 29, 9 through 12. So it's possible that Isaiah preaches and somebody else writes down. These speeches, these oracles as they're called in the English text, are fragments. And somebody, perhaps Isaiah, is the final editor or redactor or collector of all of these pieces that Isaiah has spoken and brings them together into one unit, which we have as the book Isaiah. Does that make sense? So a lot of these chapters have not been in chronological order. And in a lot of cases, I can't determine where they should go. That's not a problem. Isaiah has not arranged his material chronologically. He has arranged it thematically. And so within this corpus, within this section, 28 through 39, he's got certain parts that may be earlier or backwards, that kind of thing, but they all fit into this one major unit. Now when we get to 38 and 39, I'm actually going to examine those chapters, 38 and 39, before we look at 36 and 37, because those can be determined undoubtedly. And the chronological order of 38 and 39 actually comes before 36 and 37. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Regarding 33, I really don't know.
Are you going to get into the explanation, ye nations? Is that expanding beyond, like, just the ones that he's talked about, and then is he going bigger?
Are you talking about it in Isaiah 34? Yeah, we'll come back there in just a moment. Okay, whoever's got it, read Malachi 1. Read 1 through 5, actually, if you would.
Malachi 1 through 5.
Yes.
The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord. Yet you say, in what way have you loved us? Was it not Yeshua, Jacob's brother, or Esau, sorry, Jacob's brother? I was trying to be Jewish for a second. Says the Lord, yet Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated, and laid waste his mountains and his heritage, for the jackals of the wilderness. Even though Edom has said, we have been impoverished, and will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord of hosts. They may build, but I will throw down. They shall be called the territory of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord will have indignation forever. Your eyes shall see, and you shall say, the Lord is magnified beyond the border of Israel.
Okay, the past tenses, in verse 3 especially. He says, I hated, past tense, or loved less is an adequate translation. If we were talking about Calvinism, we'd discuss that more lengthily. Love less is fine. I loved less Esau, or hated Esau, and laid, past tense, his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. By Malachi's writing, Edom, or Esau, has already been judged. Here's the point. Isaiah 34, if it talks about Edom, talks about Esau, Esau is Edom. So says Genesis 35, Genesis 36, explicitly. Has already been fulfilled. Isaiah 34 has already been fulfilled by the time Malachi even writes the last of the Old Testament books. So whatever we're talking about, this judgment here that's pictured in Isaiah 34 has already come to pass at least by the 4th century BC, long before Christ, long before our day. Why is this important? Because some of the language that is used in Isaiah 34 is extremely formative for how we understand New Testament texts. Look at this then. Go back to Isaiah 34 and we'll flesh some of this out. In Isaiah 34, he says in verse 1, come near, ye nations. He's speaking to all of the nations. Assyria, Egypt, Edom. He's speaking to them all. But see, the Hebrews didn't have a word for the word world or earth. They had one for earth, but it didn't encompass the globe. Everybody, a universal concept. So you know what they used? Edom. Edom was just a symbol of the wicked world. And so in Isaiah 34:1, he's addressing the entire, all of the people who have situated themselves around Israel. He says, come near, listen up. Hearken, you people, listen up. And he says, let the earth hear, all that's therein, the world, and all the things that come forth of it. Everybody. He's trying to tell us that everybody is pictured in this Old Testament judgment. All of the people who are against Israel are pictured. And he says in verse 2, the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations. His fury upon all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has delivered them to the slaughter. Their slain also shall be cast out, and their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. This is very illustrative stuff. But perhaps the one that grabs us the most is verse 4, where he says, "And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. And all their host," meaning the stars, the sun, the moon, "shall fall down, as the leaf falleth off of the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree." If you were to ask Isaiah, what did you see? He sees the annihilation of the planet. If you were to ask Isaiah what that means, he's going to tell us something entirely different. He is not here seeing a literal. In the ultimate scheme of things, Isaiah is not talking about the destruction of our cosmos, of our planet. He is talking about the destruction of the wicked nations who are pitted against Egypt, or against Israel. He's talking about the destruction of Israel's enemies. So when he goes on in verse 5 and he says, "My sword shall be bathed in heaven," it's moving in upon all the wicked. He says specifically, Idumea. "And upon the people of my curse to judgment." Then we've already read verse 6, Basra, the capital city, Idumea again. And in verse 7 he says this, "And the wild oxen will do just fine. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land will be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness." He's picturing it as if the land is delivered up to God as a sacrifice. And then look at this in 34:8. "It is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion." None of this is in our future. Now, if you talk to the millennial folks, they're going to tell you it is. They're going to tell you all of this is supposed to happen in this millennium, and it's all supposed to happen in the Great Tribulation, and that whole scheme. It's very detailed. They've got it all worked out just perfectly, except for all of the flaws that come with it. Problems all over the place. What I'm saying is this. Isaiah is picturing something that has already happened way in our past. So we shouldn't be looking for this in our future. When he is talking here, he is envisioning. He is seeing something that is highly poetic, highly visionary. Some of the New Testament texts that speak this way are speaking in the same kind of way as Isaiah. So when Isaiah says in 34 and verse 4, when Isaiah says, I'm picturing the destruction of the planet. And he tells us, but by the way, that represents the destruction upon Edom. We have other New Testament texts which look mighty similar, such as Revelation 20. And John's not talking about a destruction of our planet either. He's talking about another kind of oppressor like Edom. In John's context, he's talking about Rome. Does that make sense at all? Okay, so they're not talking about the same thing, nor are either of them speaking literally, but they're speaking highly figuratively. And as there's an oppressor of God's people back here, Edom, John sees another oppressor in his own day that's quite like that. But in John's day, it's Rome. It's a different person, a different figure, different emperor, so to say. Any questions, any comments through verse 8?
This has a note here, but I just want to make sure it's right. But it compares 34:4 to Matthew 24:29.
Good point.
Is that?
Yes. Go ahead. Do you have Matthew 24 for us?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and read that one if you don't mind.
"Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken."
Okay, is that all of it?
I guess verse 32.
Yeah, read also verse 30.
"And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory."
This kind of speech is highly figurative. In Matthew 24, he's not speaking of Edom, of course not. Malachi had already said that could happen. But in Matthew 24, who's the oppressor in that day? Who's going to be judged there? It's Jerusalem. He's not talking about a worldwide judgment, even upon you and me, and he's not talking about the day where everybody's going to bow and confess. That's not the day he's talking about. In the context, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, namely in AD 70 when the Romans move in. These passages are highly figurative, and we've got to look at them in their context. It helps us in Matthew 24 when he goes on in verse 34 and tells us even, oh, by the way, all of these things will happen in this generation. So that makes it very clear. Any questions or other comments?
So this is the materializing idea, like you're saying, as far
Yes.
as evil or whatever. All that the writers are trying to do is to give some kind of tangibility to the idea of fear.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Yeah, Isaiah's got a philosophy in view. Oh, sure, in his day he's talking about Edom. Oh, and sure, in Christ's day he's talking about Jerusalem. And in John's day he's talking about Rome. But there are other passages, which we're not working with at the moment, but there are other passages that use that same philosophy to teach us there's a day coming in our future where it's all going to be taken care of. So, look at 34:9, Isaiah 34:9. This one's tricky. And yes, Nioka, go ahead.
What is the time period that Isaiah projects what's going to happen to Israel? Is that from, I know he's mentioned in Samuel and Chronicles.
Okay, yeah, Chronicles mainly, yeah.
Right, and it just seems like it goes with world history all the way through up till just about for Christ.
Yes. Excellent question. That's a really tricky question. I don't know if y'all feel the same force of that as I do. But, what's that?
I know it can't be exact as far as the...
Yeah, that's tricky. And if you couple that with Dusty's question about, well, what's the chronology of all this and where does this oracle fit in, you really got a problem. Because it's separate discourses. If I preach a sermon this Sunday and I preach to us from the book of 1 Samuel, you're going to be aware that I'm preaching about a completely different time frame as if I preach from the book of Matthew, right? We're quite a ways apart there. Well, in the same way, Isaiah has several different sermons in his book that come together to form our collection of 66 chapters. He can speak about a host of different things. So Isaiah's book is kind of all over the place, but it's arranged in a way to help us try to read it somewhat effectively. Isaiah speaks about the years 740 through 681, and that's a questionable thing. But where does he ultimately go to? I'm convinced that the last of his thing reaches the cross, somewhere with the Christ. And Isaiah 53 is probably the peak of all of that. And we'll really work with Isaiah 53 when we get there. The suffering servant. Remember that text? Okay. He's been bruised, and he's taken on him our afflictions. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, that kind of thing. That's Isaiah 53. Well, I'm convinced that Isaiah goes back and forth in preaching. So in Isaiah chapter 7, he goes all the way up to the virgin birth. But in Isaiah 53, he goes all the way to the cross. In Isaiah 34, as we're in right now, he only goes up to the judgment of Edom, so not nearly as far. So he's constantly going and coming back, going and coming back. But ultimately, he lives in the 8th century. And I would actually say that in the context, his primary reference, his primary discussion rests right here in his own day. But in the words that he presents, God finds more meaning and takes us even further to the cross. Does that make sense? Tricky stuff. Yeah.
When we read a book, we're used to reading things in chronological order unless it's an explicit flashback.
Yeah.
But as we're going through and studying, we're jumping to Matthew, we're jumping to Malachi, we're jumping to Genesis, we're jumping all over the place. But Isaiah, in a way, is a book of cross-references pulled together thematically, like we may pull a topic together from different books.
Yeah. Kind of. Yeah. It's tricky. It is tricky. Yeah. Anything else?
We were comparing to Revelation earlier a little bit. I was talking about Rome, but kind of reminded me how Revelation around, jumps forward, talks about the total destruction, then comes back and zooms in on part of, what that'll be. So maybe some similarities there as well.
Could be. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'd have to know if you're talking about a specific text or tricky stuff. Like there are about 3 big references in Revelation that most people say, oh, that's got to be end time material even in our future. And for what it's worth, I would contend that they're actually about Rome. Those 3 chapters would be, the 3 units would be chapter 6, chapter 14, and chapters 20 and 21 as a unit. And I would say all of those are actually rooted in Rome's context.
Yeah, still all within Rome's time frame.
Yeah.
Some of them talk about the very end of Rome, and some of them
I see.
talk about details.
Very good. Yeah, excellent.
Jumps around the same way.
Clyde.
Of course, we know that the Jews were God's accepted people back there. Did he talk about the Gentile world at this time?
Yes, I think he is. When he's talking about the judgment of the world at this time, he's not talking about a complete annihilation of the planet. He's talking about the enemies that are around Israel. Yeah, I think that's right.
So Gentile would be the
Yes.
main problem.
Yes, I think that's perfectly accurate. Anything else? Okay, look at 34:9. This is the kind of text that most people grab a hold of and start preaching about the end of the world and that kind of thing once more. But we've seen the context doesn't lead us that way. And so he says in 34:9, the streams will be turned into pitch. The dust will be turned into brimstone. And he says the land will become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night nor day. The smoke thereof will go up forever. From generation to generation it will lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. Okay. Most people say, this is when the world has finally exploded with fire, burned up, and there's nothing else after it. That's difficult, and here's why. First of all, the context doesn't lead us that way. And the second reason is, look at verse 13. In verse 13, he says, and thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof. And it's going to be a habitation of dragons and a court for owls. Not literally. He's using a picture for us. You've got to think with Isaiah. We've got to think with the prophet as he sees what he's seeing. In one moment, 34:9 and 10, he sees the world being burned up, completely quenched with fire. But in the very next image, what he sees is, and now it's like a palace that's been overrun by the wild animals and by the thorns and the bristles. Well, both can't literally be true. You see the problem? If we take both literally, either it is all going to be burned up or it's not. Which is it? Both are pictures of desolation, judgment. And that's all we need to think of. We don't need to start zoning in on all the specifics and start saying, well, I wonder when this literally happened in history and we can see the fire on the earth. Nah, that's the wrong way to go at it. What he's talking about is one major theme. The whole theme in Isaiah 34, and as Clyde suggested, it's about the Gentile world. But what's he seeing about the Gentile world? You wouldn't be wrong if you said, it's about fire, and it's about the thorns, and it's about the beasts, and it's all about Edom. All of that's true. But what we're seeing is a big picture that comes together in a portrait, and it wears the title, Judgment. See, in a lot of these cases, we don't need to think so specifically, and sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. You know what I mean? Sometimes, here's another analogy, let me use it this way. Sometimes we see brush strokes when we ought to be seeing portraits. Isaiah is presenting to us a picture, a portrait. The portrait is one of judgment. It's upon the wicked world in his day. But sometimes we zone in and look at all these fine details, and Isaiah's saying, just think of judgment. I'm convinced that's the way we ought to go with this. So in 34:9 and 10, when he talks about smoke going up forever and ever, fire, eternal fire, it calls our minds back to another judgment in their history, Sodom and Gomorrah. Doesn't this remind us of Sodom and Gomorrah? Sometime when you've got a moment, read Genesis 19:24 and you'll see the similarity. He's calling their minds back to a judgment that God had wrought before. Okay, look at 34:11. But the cormorant, or perhaps the pelican, and the bittern, perhaps the hedgehog. So you've got the pelican and the hedgehog will possess it, speaking of the planet. The owl, the raven, they'll dwell in it. He shall stretch out upon it the line of confusion, the stones of emptiness. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom. Remember, he just saw the planet being burned up, and now he's got animals taking over. He's got the kingdom still in existence somehow. But none shall be there. They walk into the courtroom to see Hezekiah on the throne, and there's nobody. Instead, there are animals in the courtroom. Judgment. Desolation. It's dormant. And it says in verse 12, and her princes will be as nothing. Verse 13, we've read, the thorns will be in the palaces, nettles and brambles, that sort of thing. Verse 14, wild beasts of the desert will meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the goat shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. There shall the great owl make her nest, and lay, and hatch, and gather under her shadow. There shall the vultures also be gathered, every one with her mate. What's he saying? Judgment. Judgment. Everything lies desolate. Okay, so he says in 16, seek ye out of the book of the Lord, and read. No one of these shall fail. God's already told us, you depart from me, judgment's moving in. You side with me, God's going to take care of you. Well, he says this, none shall want her mate, my mouth it hath commanded, his spirit it hath gathered them. And then it says in 17, he hath cast the lot for them, and his hand hath divided it unto them by line. They shall possess it forever, from generation to generation shall they dwell therein. Okay, really lengthy way of just simply saying God's going to judge the wicked. He's going to vindicate Jerusalem. Zion's going to be exalted again. Any questions, any comments from 9 through 17?
And speaking of the judgment, my scripture here had a reference to Hebrews 12, talking about verse 28, 29. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, thus have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire.
Yeah.
So it's that same concept. It's the selling of the idea of judgment. And we can't really dwell. I mean, we understand that, the purest way to purify anything is to burn it.
Yeah.
But that's just the idea of it, and not to dwell so much on
identity or
the tangibility of a pelican or whatever. It's that idea, it's that concept.
If you've got it, read 26 while you're there. I'll come to you in just a second. But read Hebrews 12:26 if you've got it.
Whose voice then shook the earth, but now he hath promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven.
Okay, in Hebrews 12, Paul is writing, I'm assuming Paul is writing, but who's he writing to? Oh, well, of course he's writing to the Hebrews, people in Jerusalem. When is he writing? Probably about AD 68. What's about to happen? What are they undergoing? Jewish persecution. Who are these that he's writing to? Righteous Jews, Christian Jews, Jewish Christians. What is he talking about when he talks about the earth and the heavens being shaken? And then he says, oh, and by the way, our God is a consuming fire, judgment's moving in. It's interesting that this language here in the New Testament is once more drawn from our Old Testament. Isaiah is constantly being echoed or alluded to in the New Testament. In Isaiah 13:13, he says, therefore I will shake the heavens and earth, and the earth will remove out of her place. But he had already told us that judgment spake of Babylon. In Hebrews 12, once again, he's speaking about another national judgment, specifically the one upon the city of Jerusalem. See, what we're going to find as we move through Isaiah, we keep seeing these pictures or these phrases that really become used again in the New Testament. The New Testament writers constantly, Isaiah is the second most used book in the New Testament. They're constantly going back there and grabbing portraits from it, or pictures, or texts, and saying, remember how Isaiah spake? It's happening again. Not the same person, the same kind of thing, the same kind of event, same kind of person. And they're constantly recycling Isaiah's text in that way. Okay, we're at the end of 34. How much time do we have?
3 minutes.
About out. Okay, any closing comments or questions? Clyde, that's right.
We go back to the millennialist. they want to tie this in, a whole lot of it with Revelation.
Yeah.
Which is not so. Because they want to talk about the tribulation period and battle of Armageddon. You know, there's no battle of Armageddon. I mean, that's,
It's a concept,
just, you know, and so they want to tie all this into end time, when the world will end.
Yeah.
And that you pointed that out already. This was at this point in time.
Yeah.
Not future time.
Yeah, true. Difficult texts. 35 is part of 34. We'll pick up there next time. We'll get out 2 minutes early. Thank you for your kindness. Betty.